Namaskaram, Aparna ji. Nice to meet you finally. So glad to connect. For those of you who don't know Aparna, she is a American-born Malu transfer, grew up in Kerala, woman who has a lot of amazing life experiences. And we're going to get into that a little bit today. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Aparna.
Thank you for having me. Really nice to be on the show and finally actually seeing you and speaking with you face to face virtually. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about some things that I'm really passionate about. And I know that your kids are kind of having a similar upbringing to what I did. So really excited to kind of share some insights and that kind of stuff today.
Wonderful. So great. So I just wanted to learn a little bit more about your upbringing, and I know you've given a lot of interviews online and talking about your childhood, talking about your experience, talking about moving from the US to Kerala in India and learning Malayalam. But I wanted to specifically ask a little bit more about kind of the community aspect of your upbringing and how you felt influenced by Indian culture growing up and learning a little bit more. And for those of you who follow us on the Invisible India podcast, my kids are going through a somewhat similar experience to Aparna. So I wanted to get some advice from Aparna ji today to learn a little bit how I could be a better parent and understand a little more about what my kids are going through growing up in India. So could you just give us a little rundown on your background? I mean, you don't have to go long. You know, there's been plenty of other interviews that you've done, but just give us a little introduction.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So basically, I guess it all starts with your parents, right? So my parents loved to travel. Both of them were traveling and also kind of looking for a deeper meaning to life on their own paths. My mom is from South America. My dad is from the United States. And they were just doing their own thing. They actually met in India a long time ago. And they just kind of hit it off. And of course, they decided once later in life, okay, let's make this our home base. But first, they had me and they wanted me to be an American citizen. So they made sure to go to the US for a few years. And so I'm American, although I spent most of my upbringing, my crucial getting raised years in India. So when I was 3 years old, 3 to 15, I was settled. For the first year, we traveled a little bit, but then I was settled in an ashram community in South India, Kerala. Amma's ashram, Mata Amritapuri Amma. You may know her as the Hugging Saint. She travels around the world hugging, and she's a huge humanitarian person of this age. So yeah, basically we settled in Amma's ashram, and it's a little bit different, of course, than your children who are growing up maybe in a city or in a town in India, more in the public's eye. We were a little bit more sheltered. The people around us were all friends and family, and we knew them, and that type of thing. And there was a mix of both Westerners and Indians, so which is why I have an American accent today. And yeah, a lot of people ask me. And so when I was about 15 years old, my dad actually moved to America when I was 6. And when I was 15, I was a teenager. I was starting to have these desires of exploring the world, seeing America. And the only time I had seen America before that was every other year I would go for my Christmas vacation to see my grandmother who lived in New Mexico. So my dad would come pick me up and we would go over or I would come with my mom and we would go to New Mexico. And other than that, I didn't really have any idea of Western culture. Since it was an ashram setting, we didn't really have TV or internet easily accessible. So I didn't really know much about pop culture or American movies or anything. And when I was 15, I moved to the United States. And I'm sure you would assume there was definitely some sort of culture shock involved in that transition. So that's kind of like the gist. So 3 to 15 India, 15, and I'm still kind of in the West. But a few years ago, I moved to Spain, which is where my wife is from. And now we have settled in France because of her work here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're a really great example of a third culture kid, if you've heard of that
For sure.
term. You probably have a lot of things in common with people that are in the army and things of that sort. However, you had the connection to be able to really be a part of an inclusive Indian community, and I'm going to hear more about that. As far as your upbringing in India, I imagine in the ashram it was a very, like I said, like inclusive environment where people were used to a lot of foreigners. And so did you ever feel like you had to kind of modify yourself to fit in, or was it just like a very natural kind of community acceptance?
It definitely was more of an accepting environment because they were used to Westerners coming through, either just for visiting or for actually staying there. Like my mother, she basically has given up her Western life and she lives permanently in the ashram doing a lot of service. And she doesn't like coming back here. So if I want to see my mom, I have to go back there, which is fine with me. I love going back. But yeah, a lot of people, it is very welcoming and a homey feel there. But then there's the schooling aspect of it. I did go to first a public school when I was quite young, and then carried on to a private Indian school. The public school was not an English medium school. At that point, that's when I learned the alphabet. I was in UKG, they say, it's under kindergarten.
Yes.
And so I learned the Malayalam alphabet there. And but when I transferred to the private school system, actually Malayalam was an optional language, even though we were in Kerala, and I took Sanskrit instead. So to this day, my reading and writing of Malayalam is very poor. But I'm okay with that. There's not much reading that I do. But speaking, I was able to learn to speak by just conversing with my friends, hanging out with my friends. So a lot of people ask, like, how come you have like that Kerala slang? It's just really because I just like was raised with the kids and like by playing and fighting. That's how I learned to speak. So that's why I speak like them.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, your Instagram name is Inverted Coconut. And for anyone that hadn't thought about that or thought through that, I think there's such a brilliant way of explaining. Our friend, Sam George, is the author of a book called The Coconut Generation. And in that book, he explains that a coconut describes a lot of the diaspora Indians today, where you're brown on the outside, but you're white on the inside. If you've grown up in the West, you look Indian, your parents might be very traditional Indian, right? But you yourself actually relate more with your Western peers. And so to hear your explanation of yourself I'm actually the opposite of that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm white on the outside, but I have this upbringing where I actually feel very Indian. I emote very Indian. I relate very Indian because of the way that I grew up. And I feel that actually and so about my experience, I myself am an American. I came to India first, 14 years back. But I still my formational years were all in the United States. And my kids, I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. My kids are having an experience where they're in between these two worlds. They, I want to talk about my daughter specifically because my son had the first 2 years of his life in the U.S.
Okay.
And though he looks very Indian, I mean, you would not think that his mother is white when you look at him. When they go in public, it's like, Indian bacha hai, koi baat nahi. It's just like he completely looks Indian. But my daughter, who is actually born here, who speaks like pura Bihari Hindi bolti hai. She's like totally like Bihari accent, but she presents very white in her physical appearance. She has this like kind of blondish curly hair. Has light skin, and some of her features are more a lot like me. So we've already had some experiences where a few months ago, someone came to our house and they didn't realize it was one of my husband's colleagues actually, came to our house, and I was in the other room, and they came in, and my daughter had come out, and this person didn't really know the difference. He said, "Are ye to अंग्रेज का बच्चा दिखता है?" And my husband then said, "मेरी wife American hai," and that person felt very embarrassed. And then I come out, and he looks. Okay, her actually ये एक अंग्रेज का बच्चा है actually. Yeah. So people are a bit confused about her because she presents very white, but she acts very Indian, and she even speaks English with an Indian accent, and she's only been to America once for 3 months, so all she knows is the life here. So my question and my kind of questions for you are, how can I be a good parent to someone who is growing up in this experience, who is like presenting very white? And again, like we don't really live in like a compound kind of situation. We live in a very like traditional situation where there aren't very many white people. And you're kind of expected just to behave like an Indian or like a Bihari specifically. So what tips and advice do you have me, or stories and anecdotes do you have from your childhood that you'd like to share with me to help me be a better parent for my kid as she grows up and searches through her own identity?
Okay, so yeah, it seems like your daughter is having a very similar upbringing than I did in terms of, looking white on the outside, but growing up in India and having that identity and speaking like the natives and stuff like that. Initially for me, it was very difficult because it did take me a couple years to learn the language. And during this time, I felt like an outsider, and I felt I wasn't in my community, and the people didn't understand me. Even though I was quite young, I do remember having those ill feelings. And it didn't only come from me, it was also external, because the kids also there, the native Indian kids, had never really engaged or even seen a Westerner face to face. So there are some words that in Malayalam they call people of white skin, which I used to be called all the time, saipe and madame. And it's not like the actual meaning of the words aren't bad, but the way they say it, it's like, you're different, and and it had that like, and then but I didn't get it. I was so young, I didn't understand why I was different. But that changed gradually as I learned the language. So Malayalam was really the bridge between the two cultures for me. And once I learned and developed the language skill, people just accepted me as their own. And those are the beautiful parts of my upbringing that I really cherish and remember. And it was really like that barrier was gone, and I was just part of them. And, for competitions, sometimes they would like prefer to stick with Indians because of the accent. But after some time, I was part of like the singing competitions and that type of thing, because it's just like the dance too and that kind of stuff. So definitely learning the language, which you said she's already got a hang of. So I don't think that part will be such a big deal. The thing though is some type of like education at home, definitely to kind of let her know, you may look different, but maybe you can give her some words of wisdom to also like tell the other kids, like, we're not the same, like skin color, or we are the same, skin color doesn't matter, like that kind of things, so that she has something to say to them, to, so that she doesn't always like get hurt, but she has a response to them that makes sense, that they will understand, and they'll be like, oh, actually, that's true, we're basically the same. So that would have really helped, I think, in my upbringing. Another thing, when I look back, I'm not sure if your children are involved in like dance or music in India. Are they?
A little bit.
Yeah.
More sports.
More
Yeah, more
sports.
sports.
So that's something that I wish I had. I didn't really learn singing or a proper Indian dance. And when a lot of the things that the Western culture sees about India is the music and the dance. So when I later in life moved to the United States, I often got the question, oh, can you sing or can you dance or that type of thing? And it just didn't feel good to say no every time. Like, I mean, okay, yeah, I sing a little bit here and there. I did like some dance, but it's just, I'm not trained classically, and I had to always say no for that. And that made me feel like later in life a little bit like, oh, damn, I missed out on that opportunity. So that's one thing I have, maybe like get them involved with cultural stuff like that. Other than that, I think you're doing a great job. I'm really excited to hopefully one day meet your kids.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope we can meet face to face too. I really appreciate those words, and I also want to ask from a slightly opposite perspective. As a woman now, you've gone to the US. You said you didn't have much exposure to Western culture. Was there anything that you felt would have served you better in your transition to the West? Maybe some additional education at home or exposure to pop culture or anything of that sort. And I feel there's some similarities where, I'm not in Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, any of the larger metropolitans. So we don't have a lot of exposure to Western culture unless I specifically bring it into the home, or my husband brings it into the home. So what are some ways that would have helped you transition, I guess, to a more like global lifestyle, which you're not living today?
Yeah, I definitely have answers to that, because over my years in the West, I've realized more and more some things that could have been developed at a younger age. The first one that comes to mind is critical thinking. I'm not sure if it's the same in North India, in South India, but in school you memorize the books as you go. Like the teacher gives you a paragraph and you memorize word by word, and you don't actually understand it. And it's hard.
Recto.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's hard to make your own decisions. And this is something I struggled with a lot when I came to complete my education, my higher education in the United States. Critical thinking is definitely looking at two decisions and making a decision for yourself, not just raising your hand because the people in front of you has raised your hands. So that's number one. Number two is humor. In the West, humor is very sarcastic.
Very sarcastic.
But in India, it's more literal. And at least in Kerala, people, to make something funny, they tend to make fun of you or make fun of something. And it's not in a way that hurts, it's just in a way to make you laugh. Like you see yourself in a third perspective and you laugh about it. And I find that type of humor very funny. But in social situations in the West, when people are being very sarcastic, it goes over my head and I just don't get it. And it really makes me feel like I'm not part of like the group, or there's definitely some like difference there. So I don't know, maybe
teaching,
have them have
that
like
self-deprecation,
or even if you have
self-deprecation works definitely in the West. I haven't really tried it out here. I'm not sure, but yeah, you're totally right. Like I can imagine some awkward situations of being like, calling your friend fat or something, and in the US, and everyone here would think that's hilarious. They're like, oh, he's, whatever. And there it's like, you did not just say that. I can imagine. I don't imagine the situation.
I had to learn the hard way that you just don't say that. But yeah, like in India also, it's definitely more of like a conservative, like you don't speak unless like you're being spoken to, that type of thing. And it was difficult for me to speak up, like if you're at a dining table or if you go out with your friends and you're all eating dinner and everybody's talking, and I always have, even to this day, I have a hard time knowing when it's my turn to speak, or it's just like I don't have that natural flow of engaging in conversation. And I really, really do believe it comes from that like, oh, you're not supposed to speak now because you're being spoken to type of thing, and you just kind of sit there and listen. And yeah, so those are I think the top three things that have been a little bit difficult for me in the
Mm,
moving to the West from India.
that is a very good point. And I can definitely see that challenge. And even between my husband and I, we often have that challenge of, we're in a social situation, and my husband is, Indians in general, I think, are some of the best question askers. You can just, people just have so much curiosity, and they will keep asking you, asking you,
Mm-hmm.
asking you. And it's almost arrogant to just insert something about yourself. Whereas in Western
Mm.
communication, you just kind of start talking about yourself. That's just kind of, I talk about myself and then you talk about yourself. That's kind of the understanding. And and
Yeah.
sometimes we would have these whole conversations where, we're with someone and my husband's just asking questions to that person, and I'm like, we left the conversation and we're like, we didn't tell anything about what we're doing right now, what's going on with this, what's going on that, because, and I'm not slamming on Americans, but I'm slamming on Americans because I'm an American, you're an American, we can do that. But like, we need to be so much better at asking questions um, as Americans rather than just kind of blurting out things about ourselves and then going on to the next thing. So that I can see, that's a great point. I think that's something that we'll need to think about in the future.
Yeah, totally.
So I think, as this has been such a great conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk through some of your journeys through identity um, and your just connection with Indian culture, and how I can kind of help my kids to healthily, in a healthy way, facilitate and understand that kind of sense of belonging.
Yeah, the last thing I would like to add is it might be difficult because they look so different and they live somewhere. And then when they do go to the United States, again, they're going to feel out of place. And this is just something they're going to have to learn to deal with. And yes, you can help them at home by, warning them, and you'll always be there for them. But it's also something they're going to have to figure out on their own eventually, when they grow up. So it's just something like you can let them know, by the way, you may not feel all the way Indian when you are in India, and you may not feel all the way Western when you are in America, but you're amazing either way, and just to value what the difference that they carry within them. Because the
Mm,
first few years when I
mm-hmm.
went to the United States, I really tried to black off and, just put aside the Indian roots that I had to try to fit into the Western culture. That's a big thing that I did. And for 2 years, I didn't want anything to do with India, like nothing. And just because I needed to learn, I had to suddenly watch all these to like fit in Western music, movies, all these things, how to communicate, all these things. And I just try to fit it all in. And I really just like said no to my identity and tried to fit in somewhere else. And this made me so sad. Like I was not a happy person. I was like a introverted, sad girl trying to find her way, and was just keep getting more and more lost because I was going further and further away from my own self. So it might happen to your children as well. So, you can start helping them now with baby steps, maybe not just because when I went to the United States, I would go for maybe not even a month. It was like 2 to 3 weeks at a time. So if you do go, maybe go for a few months, and so that they get a little bit more identity from that aspect, because it's really difficult to get it all when they're like 15 years old. So, and
Yes.
then like a big,
Overdose.
exactly. A big awakening moment for me was a few years later when I was just so over trying to fit in and trying to hide myself. I had this like epiphany where I was like, actually, my father really helped me. This is like one of the changing moments of my life. He was like, because I wanted to change schools. I like didn't like anyone. No one liked me. And he's like, look, Aparna, you grew up in India. You can't change that fact. You have India within yourself, and that's a beautiful thing. find that beauty, realize it for yourself, and express that. Don't try to pretend like you're somebody else, because that pretending is what people don't like. They want to see you. And that day, I actually went to school and I was like, okay, be me, be me. And I started smiling at people, and I think they just noticed that that shift happened, and they would smile back, and then I would notice that my smile was contagious because they would take it to the next, and it was like the butterfly effect. And then that year was actually the best year of my life ever. I was in America. I had finally accepted myself, and people loved me for who I was. So that's just something that your children are going to have to realize on their own. And there's definitely things you can do on the way to prevent like such a catastrophic transition. But I mean, it's just going to have to happen. Yeah.
Wow. What a truth bomb. What a enlightening moment in your life. Yeah,
definitely. Forever grateful for my father.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Aparna. I really enjoyed talking to you. And yeah, I hope that we can meet face to face. And man, I just thank you so much for sharing your journey and being vulnerable with us and with our listeners and people who watch. And I just really hope that your story helps more people. I think it already has helped a lot of people. People can find you on Instagram at Inverted Coconut. Anywhere else people can find you or connect with you?
Well, I just started the YouTube. It's the same name, Inverted Coconut, but it's basically all the same content just on there.
So great. Wonderful.
Yeah. Awesome.
That's
well,
great.
Thank you so much for having me on your amazing show. And I really do hope, because so far I've been speaking a lot to an Indian audience, but I know that there's a lot of Westerners who have married into Indian life and that type of thing. And I would love to be able to help in any way possible. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And I hope you have a easy transition, and much love to all of your family. And once again, thank you so much. Nandi namaskaram.
Namaskaram. Thank you everyone for listening. Sunne ke liye bahut bahut dhanyawad. And really, let's show our love to Aparna and comment. Please let us know what you thought about this episode. Of course, you can find us here on YouTube. You can find our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and then Indian sites too, JioSaavn, Ghana. You can write to us at jessica@invisibleindiapodcast.com. Of course, our website, invisibleindiapodcast.com, has all of our episodes, videos, pictures, and more stuff on there. Social media, we are on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. So thank you so much for listening, and फिर मिलेंगे देखने के लिए धन्यवाद, and please keep sending us your comments, questions, and suggestions. We love it.